Welcome back. Former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe's pension is in jeopardy. Attorney General Jeff Sessions is reviewing an FBI recommendation to fire McCabe just days before he is set to retire on Sunday. Meanwhile, the Justice Department's Inspector General has concluded in an upcoming report that McCabe has not been forthcoming with its investigation to how the FBI handled its probe into Hillary Clinton's email server. In other words, he lied. Joining us now is former Whitewater independent counsel, former federal prosecutor, and Thompson & Knight partner, Robert Ray. Robert, good to see you.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for joining us. So these developments, will it force the Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, to release the report sooner? We've been waiting for this independent Inspector General report. When do you expect it?
Well, I think he said, or the indication was that it would be in the spring. So I guess what, spring's next week? I don't know. How early is spring going to come?
Like it, but yes.
What's your take on what we could learn?
Who knows? I don't know. I mean, I think this one sounds like it was on a separate track, meaning it went from the Office of the Inspector General to the FBI, and then through the Department of Justice's Office of Professional Responsibility, which would make a judgment. It's a big deal because if there's a finding that he was not forthcoming, as you point out, lied, that's a big deal within the FBI. Agents don't lie. If agents lie, they're of no use to prosecutors in prosecuting or bringing cases because they have no credibility. So that's the standard. It applies to line agents, and it applies all the way up to the director of the FBI.
So we've seen the questions about his handling of the Hillary Clinton email investigation. I think a big question a lot of people still have is the FISA court, how that was handled, what the FBI said and did with the court.
Or didn't say.
Is this something that we ought to hear from Mr. McCabe about? That's not going to be addressed in the IG report.
No, and I don't think this is the end of the story. I mean, obviously, investigations will continue. I know there are calls by Republicans for a special counsel in connection with the whole matter.
Well, the idea of the FBI and the Department of Justice reviewing itself, I mean, you can't, even the Inspector General cannot, it cannot call in and question like 24 people, according to Trey Gowdy. So how are they actually going to do an effective investigation if they can't even get to the people to
I know. I mean,
question?
I hear that. I guess my sense is, though, it is not a healthy thing for the public to come to a conclusion that whenever there's a problem, the Department of Justice is incapable of investigating itself. And I mean, other things, that's what they do. And that's what the Office of the Inspector General is designed to do, not just within the Department of Justice, but within, every department of the United States government. I mean, that's the whole point of having an Inspector General, with the degree of independence necessary to carry on an investigation and report back findings to the people who make, the decisions, which would be the Deputy Attorney General, the Attorney General, in this case, the Office of Professional Responsibility. And then with regard to, this particular matter and Andrew McCabe, the Attorney General has to make that call about, whether or not he retires with a pension or he doesn't retire with a pension.
But, Robert, is it possible, there's been a lot of emphasis on the FISA court and what they were or were not told.
Right.
But, there's also the larger issue of, FBI Director Comey at the time made the decision not to move forward with a prosecution. That was unusual.
Of Hillary Clinton and the email scandal.
Exactly. That's very unusual for an FBI director not to just simply give the evidence to the Department of Justice. They're supposed to make that prosecution decision. Given that we've kind of got two issues that seem a little odd, the FISA court and the whole way that the investigation was handled and then terminated,
right,
would that suggest that perhaps a special prosecutor might be needed?
Well, but you'd have to persuade me, and therefore I think the Attorney General or the Deputy Attorney General would have to be persuaded that there's a conflict that would prevent them from being able to do that. I mean, the situation with regard to Attorney General Sessions and the current special counsel was as a consequence of, of Jeff Sessions himself and contacts with Russians during the course of the campaign, and whether or not that would, a reasonable person looking at this would question whether the investigation could be fairly conducted. Here, I mean, it's in connection with activities that occurred during a prior administration. I don't necessarily see that there would be a conflict presented that would prevent the Department of Justice in the ordinary course from conducting a thorough investigation.
Well, wait a second.
I agree with you. I mean,
we've seen the text between Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, others as well. There was an incredible amount of bias at the top of the FBI against Donald Trump.
And of course,
they called him an idiot. They didn't want him to win. They wanted an insurance policy should he win. I mean,
right,
the insurance policy may very well be this probe about Russia. and collusion with Trump, which doesn't exist.
Right. Well, and I think, I think that's something that we're going to first need to hear from the Inspector General about as to what conclusions, if any, can be drawn as the result of his review of what happened. Now,
but that's the whole point. Do you need a second special counsel to do that? Because how could the FBI investigate the FBI?
Well, it depends on what the recommendations are and what, of course, the Department of Justice decides to do with them. And one of the things it may decide is that if it thinks that further investigation beyond the Inspector General is warranted, in other words, whether anybody committed crimes, then a question may be presented as to who's going to conduct that investigation? Will it be conducted within the department? Is it appropriate to appoint somebody outside of the department to handle all this? We don't know yet until we see the report. Well,
I think it can work if you have an attorney general who is not recusing himself from the job of managing the FBI. And I think it's really significant that you were the independent counsel. You had that authority, and yet you're cautioning against giving people that kind of really unaccountable power, right? I mean, I assume you wondered at times, this is kind of odd. I'm not reporting to any constitutionally valid executive branch officer.
There's certainly freedom in that, and there's certainly limited occasions where we think that that's appropriate, but it has to be balanced against the fact that when these things are created, they take a life of their own.
Right.
I think the default position should be, for a number of reasons. One is, you don't want the country to conclude that the Department of Justice is incapable of investigating itself. That's not healthy.
But it might be.
But there are a limited number of occasions when a conflict is truly presented where it's appropriate to have outside help. Special Counsel Mueller's investigation is one of them. But it doesn't mean that we should get into the habit, and I think that's been the tendency, unfortunately, since Watergate, not just at the federal level, but every place. Whenever there's a problem, the first thing everybody wants is a special counsel to come in.
Should the Mueller thing not have happened either?
Well, I mean, I think, the president obviously has very definite views about whether or not, Sessions should have recused himself so early. And the tendency, tends to be also that when ethics people get involved, the recommendation always seems to be, oh, no, don't touch this. There's a conflict. Right. I guess I'm of the view, on the one hand, that special counsel investigations should be reserved for a limited number of circumstances. I don't think people should just jump to the conclusion that a conflict exists. And I think that should be carefully weighed in the process.
The bright line I hear you saying is that if it's the current administration investigating itself, maybe a special counsel. If it's the current administration investigating a prior administration, that the new political appointees are sufficient to overcome any kind of bureaucratic bias that might be in the institution itself.
I think that's generally right. I mean, you also have to be concerned, of course, in the political process of using the powers and levers of government, including prosecutorial tools, to do damage to the opposition. I mean, in other words, I've said many times, prosecution is not politics by other means. You're talking about locking people up and sending them to jail. That's not the way we conduct politics. We conduct politics at the ballot box.
Real quick,
we don't send
Wall Street
people to
Journal
jail.
article worth reading. People whose futures are uncertain in the White House administration. I mentioned David Shulkin and H.R. McMaster. Well, the third one mentioned is the Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, and then Rod Rosenstein. So you have a different scenario if they can clean house at Justice.
How much is this special counsel probe costing taxpayers?
I don't know.
I know actually it was
there's a budget.
Yeah, it was I think $7 million in the first 5 months. I'll double check that, but that was just the
but
first.
I'm just wondering.
White hot water sort of reached a tipping point when we started talking about a budget of $70 million. Look.
And how long did that go on?
Too long.
2 years?
No. Way past that. Way past that. And look, the one lesson that I think has been learned is that these investigations should not be allowed to go on forever.